for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning into the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. You know, this is your host, GP Jacob, and we are circling back today to the topic that kicked off this podcast. We're talking about the Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment. This is 48 acres of city-owned land on the north side riverfront on the Mississippi River. This is the largest contiguous development opportunity left on the Mississippi River. I started paying attention to this project in like 2014 or so. It has huge implications. And in 2019, we started recording this podcast to bring information to the community about the Upper Harbor Terminal, to criticize the development. And now we're 100 episodes into the podcast, and we haven't really talked about the Upper Harbor Terminal for some time. So today, what we want to do is start the process of circling back to the Upper Harbor to see where this development is at now, and to continue to use this project as a tool for understanding how capitalism works in the Twin Cities. And I couldn't have a better guest on the show today to help us talk about this development and to help us gain some insight. My friend and my comrade, Kswiftly. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to be here.
Hell yeah. So, I wanted to talk with Kaylee on the show today, and we have so much to talk about. Kaylee and I have been reflecting over the last couple of days, because in 2019 and 2020, Kaylee and I both attended every single meeting of this community advisory committee that was put together around the Upper Harbor Terminal. So we were attending meetings twice a month, sometimes more than that, and really following how this process was moving. And it was the start of the COVID pandemic in March of 2020 that shut those meetings down and put the process online. But before that, we were really like bulldogging this process. And that was the same period when we started this podcast. And one of the last things that I did before quarantine sent us all home is went to the state legislature to testify against the bonding request that the city put in. The city was asking for $20 million of state money for this Upper Harbor Terminal project. Kaylee and I went and testified together. So giving listeners kind of a context to how Kaylee and I are coming into this conversation. That being said, I want to just ask you, Kaylee, when you look back at that period, like before the pandemic hit and these Upper Harbor Terminal meetings, when you were preparing for this conversation, what does that bring up for you? You know, like what were your main takeaways around attending these meetings? And maybe we could just open it up like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so weird looking back at these meetings and sort of trying to reflect on who I was and where I was and how I was thinking, how I was feeling. What I can say for sure, the number one memory that really hit me is like pure exhaustion. This was not a fun process. Like towards the end of it, right before the pandemic happens, you know, we were going to almost every meeting, and we would we chop it up before the meeting, chop it up after the meeting, and it was hard to be there. And we kind of I remember it, like the only reason we were still showing up is because we had this little group of us that were still showing up. You know what I mean? Like we needed each other to be okay to go to those meetings. And they were hard. They were hard to stomach. It was hard to deal with what was happening. It was hard to process the fact that everything, that entire sort of process felt like this sort of theatrical performance, this idea that we're going to say all the right things and try to do all the right things, but what we're actually going to do is going to be the complete opposite, but we're just going to tell you that we're doing the right thing all the time. And So yeah, as I started to look back, I definitely, the first thing I started to think about was like how exhausted we were and frustrated we were and how difficult going to those meetings were. I mean, they made every part of those meetings was miserable for anybody that was
Yo,
not there.
and I want to give listeners a context. These meetings we're talking about, it was called the CPC. Do you know what CPC stands for?
It was the Upper Harbor Terminal Community Planning Committee, I think.
Community Planning Committee. Thank you. So for listeners who don't know, maybe didn't start with us at the very beginning, there was a huge pushback to this Upper Harbor Terminal development. Over the winter of 2018 and 2019, the developers, who are one of the largest real estate firms in the city, owned by the Polead family, which is this white billionaire family that really dominates the economy of Minneapolis, one of the wealthiest families in the country. They're planning this real estate development with a live music venue and apartments on this north side riverfront. And North Minneapolis is traditionally a black community in Minneapolis that's been redlined, that's been oppressed, that's been over-policed. And now you have this white firm coming in to remake the riverfront. You know, a huge aggressive push for gentrification. And in 2018, 2019, there was a community movement, people from various different projects, people who are into urban agriculture, people who are into housing justice, people who are into environmental justice, came together to challenge this development. Because I was a part of that movement, we're calling ourselves Eco Harbor. So there was this alternative vision that was developing for using this riverfront for ecological justice, for community education. This was like led by, black people from the north side and working class people from around the city. We really challenged, and we got a delay in the vote in 2019. The city council, we pushed so hard that they said, okay, we're gonna wait on the vote. What they did was come back 2 weeks later with this idea to put together a CPC, a community planning committee. And they said, that's how we're going to address the concerns of the community. You know, we're going to democratize it. We're going to have Northsiders up there talking to us. And they passed the plan then. They greenlit this development. The protesters and the people who were pushing back, we didn't want a committee. We wanted the project stopped. We wanted the relationship with the real estate developer severed, and we wanted a whole new process. So this inaugurated a CPC, a community planning committee, which was people from the community had to apply to be a part of it. And the city, the mayor and the city council chose who was on the committee. These were the meetings that Kaylee and I were attending. So that happened in the the winter of 2019. The vote happened. And then I think the first CPC meeting was in June of 2019. I went back and looked. So the summer of 2019, Kaylee and I started attending these meetings, and they didn't allow for public comment in the meetings. That was one thing I really remember. This is supposed to be a community planning committee, but us who are community members who weren't on the committee, we had to be dead silent the whole time. A lot of times at first they didn't even have space for us to be in the room. They really didn't want us there. We kind of had to do you remember them early meetings when we had to pull chairs up right behind?
Yep.
Then they moved it to a different room. One thing looking back at my notes I wasn't clear on the law then, but what came to surface since is that they were breaking open meeting law this whole time. They didn't allow people to record the meetings, which is illegal.
So, and what's interesting too is who directed that, the not recording thing. It was actually members of the CPC who were the ones who decided that they did not want the meetings to be recorded unless they consented, and they did not consent to those being recorded. So the city was willfully breaking open meeting law on behalf of their appointed CPC. Yeah,
and in complete negligence by the city staff who allowed them to make that decision, who should know the law, but who, to them, they had the same interest. They weren't interested in more people getting involved, you know?
Right.
One thing I wanted to say, this is a criticism I've raised before, but I think it's important to name today as people are thinking about the Upper Harbor. We might have new listeners. Is that a condition for being on this committee was you had to agree to the fundamentals of the development. So you had to agree that there would be an amphitheater on site, an outdoor music venue that would be 6,000 to 10,000 seats. You had to agree that the Polads would be the development team. You had to agree to the plan. They didn't allow dissenting voices by foundation. which is why I didn't apply to be on the committee. And I still think why the committee was illegitimate from the start, you know? And this is what I feel like one of the enduring lessons that both you and I, Kaylee, like became more clear for us through participating in this process is that these city-led community engagement projects, these types of committees, they're 100% used in the service of the capitalist class to force their agenda. It was a way to diffuse the protests. It was a way to co-opt that energy. And it was a way to create a class of people who claim to represent the community, but who are working for the developer in the city. And that's 100% what this committee was. Just by definition, you had to, if you said, no, I don't want this to go to the wealthiest white family in the state, I don't want there to be a music venue, you couldn't join the committee.
Yep.
You know? So it's just like, that right there made it illegitimate.
Absolutely. And I think, those were not things that I was completely aware of when I started going to those meetings. I was going to those meetings originally through work, and eventually work decided that it was no longer a productive use of my time. But I was so personally involved in that project at that point that I started to go, on my own. And I mean, even without knowing those things from the jump, I could see that it was fake, that there was not actually any intent on the CPC side to do any sort of major pushback to this project. I mean, and the pushback that they were willing to raise were quite literally still in line with like capitalist interests, but they were doing it on behalf of like Black capitalism. They were trying to find as many ways to continue wealth building initiatives for Black people on the north side without addressing the fact that the vast majority of people in this area had like a median income, a general income of less than $30,000 a year per household. So they were representing the class interests of not the people who lived in this immediate area. They were representing, and as I got to know who these people were, and as we started to look into, who the members of this committee were, what we started to find out is a lot of these people are business owners. A lot of these people have like legitimate business interest at the Upper Harbor Terminal, who would benefit from that project being there, and from the subs. Again, this is a once in a lifetime project, but what that also means is that this project is paving the way for a lot of other development in this area. Particularly, there are a lot of industrial riverfront sites south and north of the Upper Harbor Terminal that are not currently supposedly on the market, but that we kind of understand are probably going to be coming up soon in the next 10-15 years. So if this is a project that goes through, this sets a precedent for the properties around it as well, which all end up being business opportunities for the people represented on this committee.
1,000%, 1,000%. I want to lift up two things that you said is like, for really the context now, we're in 2022. We've been talking about gentrification, and how this project fits into it for North Minneapolis. Anybody who's in the Twin Cities right now, go drive down Broadway Avenue, drive down West Broadway, and you'll see that almost every storefront, almost every building is empty. They're really paving the way to change West Broadway. And it's kind of an open secret in like government circles and nonprofit circles that the light rail is going to move down Broadway. They're going to build a new light rail line that goes down Broadway. And the Upper Harbor Terminal is very much a part of that same capital flow. That's what the ruling class is doing right now, is preparing for a capital flow into North Minneapolis. You had Eric Wan, who is a consultant to First Avenue, who's a partner on the development, a longtime government worker who intentionally moved to Minneapolis to buy a certain house in his retirement and got deeply involved in moving this development over north. He straight up said it. He said, look, the housing stock over north is too valuable for the current population. What we need to do is help those people move out to the suburbs, and we need to recapitalize by putting these houses back on the market. So you just laid it out really clearly that this is like the next decade is going to be huge for North Minneapolis. And then just what you said about the makeup of the committee is so real. It's a small clique of people who are keyed into these opportunities. It's the business class, or it's the nonprofit class who make a living off of pretending like they're the brokers for the community. A good example, like one of the most dominant voices on the committee as we were going to watch these meetings was an elder gentleman who spoke a lot about, representing the North Side. We learned that he hadn't lived on the North Side for years. He lives in Plymouth, which is a wealthy suburb of the North Side, and he's a landlord over North. Again, a direct interest in seeing the property values rise. So it's like, that was really the character. And one thing I remember looking back at this is these meetings were so foul. Like,
they were so foul.
They were really, really poorly facilitated. A lot of conflict, a lot of disrespect that happened, and just like really.
Which can I pause you right there? Because I
Please.
also want to bring in the facilitation of these meetings as being another example of the ways that like the Black bourgeois and the consulting class end up being essentially agents for the consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of mostly white people, but also some select Black people who are willing to sort of be that comprador class. So like the consulting firm that they go to quote unquote facilitate these meetings are also supposedly community members. These are also Black people who have an interest in the success of other Black people. It's a fucking lie. Like,
Yeah,
you guys, it was so frustrating. And just the elder gentleman that you brought up wasn't the only business owner on that committee either. I mean, there was the other gentleman who owned like an elevator company.
yep. That was positioned like right in that same area.
Yep. There's also, people who are coming from business and like big corporations, Fortune 500 companies who are prominent in the Twin Cities, who would be, again, big funders, sort of development backing firms for this type of a project. And then again, the rest of them were, you're right, coming out of this sort of nonprofit sphere, this like professional organizer class who are being paid and trained to co-opt the energy of community and speak as though they represent community when in fact they're representing their own class interests.
100%. And it's like, we've said this on the show before, but I think it's worthwhile as we're doing a review to name the McKnight Foundation. I talked about in the intro how the city council delayed the vote because the community pressure was overwhelming. And then the tactic that they used was to create this CPC process, and that's how they pushed the development through. At that same time, the McKnight Foundation, which is a big ruling class foundation that comes from 3M money in town, they created a $250,000 grant to do community engagement in tandem with the city. And there was a local consulting firm and one of the biggest nonprofits in the city, Pillsbury United Communities, partnered together and got that grant. And for them to accept that grant, they also had to agree to the fundamentals of the development. They had to agree to the same developer, they had the same mandate to pass this development that the committee had. And those meetings were incredibly dysfunctional. And you could really see the way that they were bringing people together and stifling criticism. They were giving people false options. They were misleading people, and they did their job. They really disorganized the community. I think you laid that out so clearly.
Yeah. I was just going to say a good representation of the fact that this process was not supposed to raise any sort of dissent. I remember when literally after months, finally the conversation of this music venue comes up. And when presenting this music venue to the committee, the options that the committee are given were to decide the name of the music venue. Right. So it was the presumption that the music venue exists. And then to make it even more foul, they suggest you should name it after Prince, which was, again, if anybody is curious, like look into the history of First Avenue and Prince, because they use Prince's name and put his name in this beautiful gold star in their building. They would not headline Prince for many years because they didn't headline any Black artists for many years. So,
and just the whole idea of like Prince's philosophy of like owning his music and bucking the big white corporate actors in the entertainment industry, and they want to co-opt his image when it's literally white billionaires, you know what I'm saying? So opposite what he was about. And like such a corny maneuver, because it's like even before the CPC, First Avenue had pitched this project in a room I was in, and they were already calling it the Prince Amphitheater or whatever, you know? So it's like obviously just like this concocted way to try to capitalize on Prince's image. And that's a part of gentrification, you know, is branding a city. And Prince is like a
That's PR.
powerful brand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing to name just for listeners. We talked about the Polead family. There's the lead developer on this project. The co-developer, their partner is First Avenue. So that's just something to name. You know, you probably figured that out through context clues, but this is the other piece I think might be interesting for us to touch base on in reflection, and then maybe we could talk about where things stand now, is this shift. The pandemic hit. You know, we had been kind of following this process. The state bonding money was expected to come in March, so we were contesting that. It looked like it was going to go through, and that was kind of like the nail in the coffin in a sense. But then the pandemic happened, and these meetings got shut down. We all got sent inside. And then after that, George Floyd was murdered by the MPD, and we had an uprising. I know that's like a really big prompt, and there's so much in there, but like as you were preparing for this conversation and thinking about that dynamic in that moment in time, like what comes up for you?
Yeah, I think to sort of just start it out, like you're kind of outlining it, but that was an incredibly dramatic shift. Like those meetings felt extremely restricted and stifling when we were going in person. But to give you like some context, like you're going in person, they're telling you that public comment is not allowed, and it's not allowed on the official record. They're not going to be putting it in the meeting minutes and things like that. You could speak up. You were kind of frowned upon, but we did it a lot. We spoke up in opposition a lot. And then you're talking about a transition to a completely online format where not only are you not allowed to be on camera, you can't even make faces, but your line is perpetually muted. You don't even have an option to attempt to speak up. You're being completely barred physically from that process. And those options for voicing that dissent and that opposition went from already minimal to completely non-existent. It's also just really weird. It's wild thinking about it, because we went and testified at the state capitol, I think literally like 4 days before the first shutdown. So it was right there. It was like right there. And the only thing I really remember from that experience was running into then council member Philippe Cunningham in the hallway, and us both not being able to find the chamber, and me just like not wanting to speak to him at all because I could not stand him, and like had been in this opposition position against him for more than a year at this point. And just for him to be like, we should look for the room together. And I'm just like, I hate you. Don't talk to me. Fucking
That's
weirdo.
so funny. One time I was unlocking my bike after a meeting, and he came up to me and asked me my sign.
I oh my God. Are you serious?
Dead ass. It was like a meeting too where I did speak up, and there was like a sharp exchange.
Oh, I feel like that makes so much sense.
That's funny.
I now completely understand Philippe Cunningham on a new level.
It's really true though, like what you said about how it was a real anti-democratic shift. You know what I'm saying? We're like, not like, yeah, you couldn't even be on camera on the meetings, let alone speak up. You were muted. It was like we weren't even there. It was like a complete cavern, and that was like really demoralizing. It's interesting how like some of the organizing I got involved at that time in real life was the pushback of closing of public spaces to the unsheltered. You know, that became a crisis where people would go to wash their hands and use the bathroom. All those buildings got shut down, and there was a reaction to that. You know, that eventually was a contributing factor to the uprising and to the encampment movement that followed. But how, I don't even know if we've really processed or named the way that all those public meetings got shut down. Public space in so many ways got shut down by the pandemic. You know, like, I don't think it was as clear to me. I kind of had forgot that until you brought it up.
Yeah. And I think to speak to that a little bit further too, so yes, there was this like massive shift, and it was extremely demoralizing. And in fact, I remember in those first few months prior to the uprisings, but after COVID started, that it became really hard to go to these meetings. Like we were like, are you gonna sign on? Like, maybe, I don't know, but this is terrible to listen to. It's horrible. Nobody wants to do this. On top of that, I also just want to name, and I don't know how much you want to get into it, but like the parks role, the Minneapolis Park Board's role in this process. And even though they were absent from the CPC, they were very much at the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about and talking about Upper Harbor Terminal. And as you talk about the closing of public space and the encampment movement that comes out of that, the parks end up being a sort of central foreground to that conflict, because that is where people are starting to go. When those public buildings are closed, people retreated to the parks. And then there's this massive enclosure and privatization and policing of the parks as well.
Big time.
Yeah. So, and you know, so the same way that we're talking about the CPC being this really false process, there's a parallel process happening on the park side, the CAC, the Community Advisory Committee for the MPRB, the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board. And they're also, I also find it interesting that they kept those processes separate, because like what we know about the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board is that they have a long history of understanding the relationship to public's like green space and property value increase. So we know what role the park, or what posture the park is taking as it comes to this property development. Again, it's not one of dissent. They understand that this is the creation of high value parks in this neighborhood is a benefit to them as well. And strangely enough, a lot of these actors are overlapping. You know, people who are affiliated with the Parks Board and different community advisory committees there was even shared members. There were definitely, like, I think more than one member from the CPC was also on the the Parks and Recreation Board, CAC. So who's showing up to these spaces and in what capacity, I think was also really interesting to me. And at the same time, I found it really hard to care as the pandemic hits and then George Floyd is murdered. And it became very hard to be involved in this process when your like mind and your heart and your soul is being pulled in all these different directions. You're seeing the direct result of the violence around gentrification. Like, you understand so intimately the connection between property and protection of private property and policing, which is their sole purpose, is to protect private property. And they over police our communities because they want to develop those communities. They want to put more value into those communities, and they don't want undesirable people there, which is Black people, which is non-white people. And so they have free reign from the city. They have free reign from the government as a whole, from a state that believes in this type of state-sponsored violence, to enact violence on us constantly. And it was really hard. And you bring up a really good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. But we saw this violence being enacted against mostly Indigenous and Black unsheltered folks during the pandemic leading up to George Floyd, which is also what created the amount of response that there was to George Floyd's murder.
Big time. Yeah. I think you just like, one thing for people to know then, to like draw these connections, and we've talked about on the podcast before, but you know, we're in this contentious Upper Harbor Terminal development. And at that time, you know, this is one of the biggest developments of the decade. It will be. It was then. There was eyes thinking about the Upper Harbor Terminal. And the Poleads, this lead developer, they're a dominant force in our state. They own the Minnesota Twins. They own tons of real estate downtown. They're deeply, deeply connected. So it's on people's minds. The murder of George Floyd happens, and the Poleads are some of Jacob Fry's biggest political supporters. You know, they're max out donors to Jacob Fry, who's led this pro-police push. And one of the first foundations to try to step in and co-opt the uprising and to try to defend the police in the face of calls for like radical change or abolition was the Poleads. The Polead Foundation gave several grants, like ludicrous grants, to support and bolster the police, you know? So it's like just trying to draw that connection that their real estate project over north is tied to Jacob Fry's push for more police and free reign for police to murder. And it didn't come up in the CPC at all. They didn't change the development at all. You know what I'm saying? It's like the Poleads were able to operate in that space without any challenge because they had curated this committee that wasn't going to challenge them, you know? And I think that brings me to like I feel like the other side of that, or like my biggest reflection looking at the Upper Harbor Terminal now, is that we need to build a political organization that has a holistic view on how they want to govern, has a plan for economic development, has a socialist, a communist plan for economic development, and has a analysis of how capitalism works, has a whole systems analysis. And we need to show up in these spaces as a part of that type of organization. Like you and I were showing up without that organizational backing. And what I've seen, you know, and I feel like a part of what the nonprofit system creates and a part of just where we're at is that there's a lot of really strong community leaders, people who are in these neighborhoods who are offended by these development projects, who see that they're unjust, and they get involved in that individual development project, you know, and they try to chip away and get reforms in just that area. Or there's people who are politicized around the police and they battle around the police budget and they do this work. But there's not an organization that ties us together and that helps us think about these things as a part of a system and has like a revolutionary analysis. And for me, it's like, I knew going to these CPC meetings that we probably weren't going to be able to stop this development. You know, we're up against this capitalist behemoth that's just really going to like steamroll, and they have steamrolled. But the point of showing up was to like politicize and to organize and build more of a force, you know? And it's like, I feel like now I'm like, when I look at this, I'm frustrated because it's like, okay, the Upper Harbor Terminal is going through. The project is approved. It's going to get built. I always knew that was going to happen. But I feel like to make these last years of work meaningful, what we have to do is like all of us who have been around this project and who see what's happening, we have to get together and create that type of like organization. You feel what I'm saying? Because it's like, I don't feel like I'm articulating myself the best right now, but it's like also we have to have a socialist vision to put forward. You know what I'm saying? And we have to have an alternative for what we would do on these plots of land so that when we do contest, we have that political force that could actually contest.
Yeah. And I think I completely agree. And I think, you know, sort of to bring up in that conversation something very important. You're talking about all these people. There's so many well-meaning and very active people in our communities doing, you know, all types of work, some of it really, really good work. And they are the number one targets of nonprofits. Now, nonprofits are coming into communities, looking at these people who are the loudest at these meetings and saying, hey, I'll give you a job. And we're talking about people who, out of the kindness of their hearts, are doing this work because they're passionate about it, and then are able to attach a survivable paycheck to it. And that becomes your only front for a state. Because I'm gonna be honest, you can't do this work the way that showing up to these meetings out of the kindness of your heart, it burns you out. If you're not being paid to be, and this is intentional, right? Like if you're not being paid to be there, it eventually becomes unfeasible for you to be there. You have all these other life responsibilities that are happening, kids, families, like trying to make rent and bills. And to add on to all of that, the burden of trying to organize your community is a massive burden. And also, I'm very much of the mindset, and you know, some people might disagree with me, but I do not believe in organizing as part of a career. I don't believe that you can organize and have careerist capitalist ambitions for, you know, what you do. I think that this problem, it always comes back to capitalism, to racial capitalism, to white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. And these relationships are too closely connected and too intimate to separate those. So when you're talking about creating, you know, a communist or socialist formation to combat, you know, both in the realm of ideals, but also materially combat these projects, to me, it becomes very important that they're not part of the sort of nonprofit industrial complex, that they're not .org. It's not a .org that gets created. And that makes things a lot more difficult. But that's also that was all intentional. Like, look up some of this history, y'all, about the creation of nonprofits. Read the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's a great book that has a lot of essays critiquing the rise of the nonprofits and what their role and purpose is. And Minneapolis is a fantastic example of how philanthropy gets deployed in some of the most harmful ways to completely destroy any sort of radical energy dissent for private capital's processes. And so, yeah, I think that we do need to build, we should always be thinking about building an organization. We should always, and not just thinking about it, we should be doing it. We should be building an organization that understands that there is a connection between policing, property development, food security, environmental justice. Like, all of these things are interconnected and part of the same problem. And also, that burden becomes a lot smaller the more people you have involved, the more people that you have around you supporting you and uplifting you and helping with that burnout and that destruction of energy that is so inherent to like being forced into these really exploitative processes. So yeah, I'm all for that. And it's hard because I think a lot of people have a lot of ideas of what that should look like and they don't always agree. But what happened when George Floyd got murdered? We had to just do shit. We had to show up, and we didn't know how to show up. We didn't know if we were showing up in the right ways all the time. And the reason why the radical energy of that experience got so co-opted so quickly is because nonprofits converged around that and really created a solid standpoint that was very anti-protester. We got branded as rioters, people destroying our own city, and we should go home before curfew and not cause problems and not dissent to our treatment. And like that can't be how we need to have, you're right, we need to have something in place to counter that argument, because that can't be the only voice here.
Facts. That was so on point, like the piece about nonprofits really targeting that organic leadership that develops in these meetings. You really see people showing up who are on the ground, who have a sharp analysis, and they get snatched up and they get indoctrinated and acculturated. In a sense, that's me. You know what I'm saying? Like, I've always had one foot in the nonprofits, and thank God that I've had like a foot outside of them, and I was able to be involved in working class politics outside of the nonprofit, and always had a critical perspective. But it's also a truth, you know what I'm saying? And I've been in these meetings. It's like, and that's like, again, the reason why I started this podcast is because at first I was showing up to these meetings through my nonprofit job. And when I started talking about the development team, I got told I couldn't talk about it because they're a big funder in town and they might pull our grants. And I was like, oh, fuck that. Like, has to be a breaking point. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. The next thing I wanted to talk about with the Upper Harbor Terminal is the ownership dynamics on site. And this is an actually really interesting piece, I think an important piece for us to analyze now. When this development was approved by the city council and these CPC meetings started that Kaylee and I have been talking about, the plan was for the city to sell the land to United Properties. So United Properties would then own the land and then build buildings on top of the land, and they would own the buildings as well. This was one of the issues that we really were speaking about the loudest. This is something that in the folks who continued organizing around the Upper Harbor, we talked about this being public land and talked about the importance of the ownership of the land. And this was a concession that we wrestled from the city and from the development team. So pretty late into the development, they switched and they said, okay, we're willing to keep the land public and enter into ground leases with the developer. So that's the plan now for the majority of the site. The city's going to retain ownership of the land, and they're going to enter into 99-year financeable ground leases with United Properties for these different parcels. And the plan is for this ground lease money, and I was trying to find, I thought I had seen it somewhere, but I couldn't find the projected amount for the yearly ground lease. I think it was like maybe $1 million total or $100,000. It's one of those, it's in there. And the idea is that this money every year, the city will earmark that money, keep it out of the larger budget, and it'll be recycled back into North Minneapolis for what they say are anti-displacement measures. So this is like one, I think it's important to talk about because it is a concession, a victory that we won. And now this does create, in theory, a revenue stream that could be used for the public good. But I think there's also important to talk about the limitations of this program that they've set up. One, because what becomes really important is there's a community entity in this plan. They say what we're going to do is we're going to identify some community entity, some nonprofit to partner with. And that community entity is going to be charged with making recommendations for how this money should be spent by the city every year. So every year the city will run up $1 million or $100,000 that gets recycled back to North Minneapolis. And this community entity is going to make recommendations of how it should be spent. And then the city is going to spend that money. Another thing that it names in the plan is that for that money to be dispersed, organizations have to go through the city's request for proposal process, which means that it'll be nonprofits getting this money. And again, I think we spoke on it today already, but I think what this will become is a slush fund for nonprofits over North. So there'll be a slim layer of nonprofit professionals who kind of benefit from this program. And then the developers will be able to say, hey, look, we're doing anti-displacement work, but it doesn't challenge under any of the underlying dynamics, which will mean rising rent and displacement. And the last thing I wanted to say on it is like, hey, we should celebrate or point to the potential of now some money's coming back to the city from this public land. But we should also point to like, this is really a small drop in the potential because United Properties is still going to own the buildings on top of the land, which means they'll be able to pull rent from all these different parcels. So like for the $1 million that we won back, there'll be tens of hundreds of millions of dollars that goes to First Avenue and United Properties. So again, it's like this was a concession granted, but as socialists and people who want to see a different type of economics, we have to recognize like really that whole pie should be for us. And there's ways that you could change the ownership dynamic so that all this money was recycled back into like public democratic control.
Yeah, I was able to find some information on the ground lease. It's an estimated 1 million total between the ground lease revenue and the ticket fee, which comes from First Avenue. 250,000 of that is expected to be coming from just purely from the ground lease revenue.
And to be clear, $250,000 is not a minuscule amount of money when you're talking about public budgets. The Minneapolis Police Department has $100 million, multiple hundreds of $1 million yearly budget.
It's like $194 million a year.
Exactly. So $250,000 a year to impact the real estate market in North Minneapolis is a fucking joke.
Right. Absolutely. And I think you're right that it is something that we should celebrate in that like I think it was definitely advocacy on our behalf and the people that made their voices really loud about selling public land into private ownership. And would also like to say that I feel like they turn around and kind of slap you in the face because like not only is this a drop in a bucket, is this like not really anything substantial, but they also don't have any plan for it. Like they keep saying that this is going towards anti-displacement and anti-gentrification initiatives. They have not in this entire plan stated a single initiative that they plan on working on. All they say is that vaguely they have researched anti-displacement measures and are looking to implement them and also looking to research those further. So there's no actual stated anti-displacement measures in this entirety of this proposal, except potentially making more affordable housing stock. Like that's their idea of anti-displacement.
Absolutely. And it points again to the contradictions we talked about between the actual economics of this plan and the public relations around it, because at the same time that they're promising this anti-displacement measure, their politicians in City Hall, again, these are major backers of Jacob Frey. Jacob Frey vetoed the renter-led rent control initiative last year and is a fierce opponent of rent control. So while they're talking about anti-displacement with one hand, they're trying to stop renters from being able to pass a rent control policy. And we know that rent control is like the single most effective public policy tool that would stop displacement in North Minneapolis right now. It would have to be a part of a larger package, but rent control means they can't up the rent. So it's like we need to point out that contradiction. And again, that this ground lease program is really more about public relations.
Absolutely. Can I speak on that a little bit more?
Please
I
do.
would also just like to say that, like, as somebody that knows quite a bit about the available policies that are supposedly anti-displacement policies, Jake is right. Rent control really is like the most effective at stopping displacement. And there's a reason why it's the least favorable. And that's because it is the least in support of private property ownership and private property as a form of wealth development. Second only, like the only thing that's better than that is a well-funded public housing system, which America has always refused and does not want to do. So what you get instead is a whole host, like I'm talking 15, 16, 17 different supposed anti-displacement policies that are being used right now all over the country that are very much just market-driven, market-based, very lukewarm, ineffective policy tools that don't protect the tenants, don't protect the, property owners, like people who have owned, their family home in North Minneapolis for 30 years and their mortgage is paid off and that's the only asset that the entirety of their family has. It's not protecting any of that from rising property taxes, from rising rents, or rising property values more broadly, the speculation around that especially. And those anti-displacement measures are actually absolute garbage. They're absolute garbage, and most of them are tax incentives. And they're all very buzzwordy. And even just reading through this coordinated plan, you see a ton of them. This idea of mixed use housing, which is like a very specific type of really, it comes out of a very anti-Black mentality around public housing. And that if you have deeply affordable housing or public housing, there's this mentality that creates ghettos. And so this idea around the whole basis of mixed use housing was, let's put poor people next to rich people because then they're less likely to do crime and live in ghettos if like they're around people that make more money than them, which is like a sick ass mentality to have. Really, and doesn't explain, why these things happen in the first place.
Absolutely. And it's like, and that's a good window for us to talk about the breakdown of how this housing will come online. Then they have a few different plans for the housing on site. For the first phase of the development, they're going to build 2 of these mixed income, mixed use housing developments. I think it's like 175 in one and maybe 100 in the other. And they're owned in partnership by United Properties. United Properties created a new company for this development so that they could cash in on this low-income housing tax credit environment. That's how they do these mixed income developments. We've talked about it on the show before. I'll give a brief synopsis here. We have to understand that this is a program of the Reagan era. This is really a foundational program for neoliberalism in the United States. This was a way that they really attacked public housing. So instead of public ownership, what they've done is created a tax credit program. So each state gets a certain amount of tax credits, and then big firms like US Bank, big venture capitalist firms buy those tax credits, and they're actually the owners of these buildings. So that's where the initial capital comes from. They'll put up a couple $100,000 or $1 million to finance the construction of the building. And then for the 15 years that these buildings have to have affordability requirements, they get really generous tax breaks. So it's really beneficial to the Best Buys, to the US banks, to the Wells Fargos who play in this tax credit market. And then that means that housing has to be affordable based on the area median income percentage. And these buildings at the Upper Harbor are going to have some that are like affordable at 80%, some that are affordable at 50%, some that are affordable between 30 and 50. There are 25 units on site that are going to be project-based Section 8 that are affordable to 30 and under. But the majority are not. The majority of them are above 30% of the area median income. And what people need to know is that area median income is calculated using the metro-wide area. So it's a pretty known fact that working class people and renters in North Minneapolis, by and large, make less than 30% of the area median income, less than 50% of the area median income, which means that even these units that are marketed as affordable are not very affordable to the people who need housing the most. They're means tested, which means they have all sorts of requirements for people to apply for them. And most importantly, those affordability requirements expire after 15 years. There's no long-term commitment to these units being affordable. And again, while the city retains ownership of the land, United Properties will own these buildings. They'll benefit from the private subsidy or the public subsidies that fund these buildings, and they'll benefit from the rent. And then they'll have ability to own these buildings after the tax credits no longer apply. So contrast that to, like, if we were really talking about doing something with this Upper Harbor Terminal, what would a real robust public housing strategy look like on site? You know, where the city raised the money to construct the buildings. You could then own those buildings in creative public cooperative ways where the revenue generated from the rent recycles back to the people who live in the buildings, recycles back to the public budget. You could even, that's like my vision for the site. You could even make an argument to say, okay, if you were going to have private ownership of these buildings, the millions of dollars that some landlord is going to pull from these buildings every year, which is now the billionaire Poleads, they could have at least gave that to a different landlord. You know what I'm saying? I'm not a capitalist, but it could have at least gone to some small black developers. It could have at least done that. And I think it's important to contrast the actual economics of this plan with like what else could have been done.
Yeah, and I'll take it a step further and just say that I'm not even for this going to small black developers.
Oh no, me neither. I'm just saying I know. What could happen, you know?
I know. It's funny. I was just talking recently about you know, you think in the post George Floyd era, they would have taken this like DE&I like very liberalized understandings of racial equity, like to a whole nother level. But all they've done is double down on the white supremacy of every project that they've been involved in, whether it be policing, whether it be Upper Harbor Terminal. And they're not even doing the due diligence anymore to like make it look good. I don't know who their PR firm is, but they're trash. And I'm not surprised that like these are the choices that are being made here, because even though this is a quote unquote democratic state, like this country has a long history. You're talking about a lot of these tax increment financing and tax incentives for affordable housing going back to the Reagan era, and that's a very important history because again, it's the relationship of people and property in this country is like foundational to its sort of white supremacist, capitalist, and colonial regime that's been played out on this land. So yeah, it's really frustrating to see. And again, they haven't named a single anti-displacement measure. So no. I just think it's really funny that that's like a stated intention of this plan. It's a stated priority of the plan, and there's not even a plan in place for that. They just are gonna do it as they go along is what it seems like. And then my follow-up is like, who are you gonna name as this independent community-led entity board that's gonna decide where these funds go, these measly funds that you're deciding to give away? Yeah,
that's the big question. We're talking about this community entity again, you know. So there was this community entity that's going to make recommendations for the ground lease revenue. And Kaylee mentioned before, they're also going to be in charge of the funds generated from the ticket fee. And we've talked about this on the show, but a recap, there's going to be a $3 ticket fee tacked on to every ticket that First Avenue sells for its concerts. And that's supposed to generate a revenue stream every year that this community entity will use for cultural enrichment programs in North Minneapolis. And I think that's an important piece for us to contrast to the $3 that will go to the community, and then the ticket fee, which is going to be what, $20, $30, $40, $50, $60 of these tickets that's going to go to First Avenue. And contrast First Avenue's like operation of this venue. They're going to decide the programming. They're going to get the bulk of the profit when the public put up the bulk of the capital to build the stadium. And the point I wanted to circle back to that you made was we really got to pay attention to who is that community entity and really scrutinize the way this plays out. One last piece I wanted to say about the housing, just to circle back to give people, we're doing a real overview today, not getting into the details, but there's going to be one of these affordable housing projects is going to be designated for seniors. And then there's going to be one tower on site that's unrestricted market rate luxury tower. By law, it has to have 8% of units that are set aside for affordable housing, and they're set aside at 80% of the area median income, which is like still pretty wealthy for the city. So, and they make it plain in the project that that's just a pure market driven profit machine, that tower. And then United Properties will also own a business park on site. So they're still, they're getting tons of ownership opportunities out of this public land, and they're going to pull millions from it every year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's abhorrent to see, because one thing that you mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about before we leave housing is just, you're talking about, tax increment financing and these other tax incentive programs only being enforced for 15 years, and then they can raise. So this is a long game that development companies are playing, and they know, they're not stupid. They understand that them putting this development in this area is going to raise the housing costs of this area. So the game that they play is that 15 years down the line, hopefully the values of around this neighborhood have raised significantly enough that they end up making a huge profit on the back end when they can finally raise the rents in these apartments up to market rate. And I would just also say that only, they're saying 2/3 of this development is affordable, but only 1/3 of the development is going to be what they call deeply affordable, which is less than 50% AMI, which, as Jake pointed out, is not actually affordable to the communities directly around this development. So even less of those units are going to be available, significantly less than 1/3 of these units are going to be available at anything that's, in reach for anybody in this neighborhood. So
Absolutely. And again, it's just such a low ceiling, and it's really unacceptable when you think about the housing crisis we're in, and the limited imagination in the United States is like, we could be building beautiful, high quality, deeply affordable public housing, and it's the rent seeking behavior of the Poleads, and it's them inserting themselves into our economy and our affairs that prevents us from doing that, so it's like, it's not going to happen at this site, but this development is a chance for us to agitate and try to raise consciousness around what we could actually be doing.
And not to be a pessimist, but I would just also like to say that privatization of land is a feature of this country and always has been. And they have no interest in developing a robust or substantive public housing plan in the country as a whole. The history of public housing in this country is abysmal and actually really sickening to look through, because you start to learn how incredibly undermined even the barest of minimal of public housing projects have been in this country, intentionally so, as a way to, bring it back to Reagan, support the production of the war on drugs and the war on crime, as a way to further white supremacy and colonial control of this land, and really to enrich the people that end up being the Poleads of the world. So
big time. Absolutely. One other thing I wanted to mention while we're talking today is there's an active lawsuit against the development team happening through our comrades, Community Members for Environmental Justice, CMEJ. Folks have heard Roxanne and Shalini come on the show in the past, very active around Northern Metals and other environmental justice issues, the Northside Green Zone. There's so many flaws with this project when it comes to ecological sustainability, so many violations of the city's own green zones policy, which is supposed to prioritize ecological and racial justice in this site, because again, this is one of the most polluted and toxic sites in the city. So I'm not going to get into the details of that. We'll have folks from CMEJ on in the future, I'm sure, and we've had them on in the past, but folks should know that they sued the city because the city didn't properly go through the alternative urban area review process. It's like a process that every development has to go through, where the city contrast this development plans with others to see what the impact is going to be, and they really cut corners on it. So CMEJ is suing the city on that. That's an active lawsuit right now. We'll see how that goes. I think the city's pretty confident that they're going to be able to maneuver around it, but it's important that people are pushing back on this from many different angles.
Yeah, and CMEJ, shout out to them, because they are coming at this from a lot of different fronts, but particularly a very overlooked front, but not even overlooked. Like, as you said, they're cutting corners very intentionally here. But what is going to be the environmental or ecological impact of having a 7,000 to 10,000 person amphitheater sitting right on the river?
Yeah.
And like, what processes and procedures are you putting in place to protect what is part of the uppermost parts of the Mississippi River that, as we know, flow through in many states before it makes its way down to the Gulf, which is, the same types of concerns that people were bringing up around Line 3. What is the environmental impact going to be if we know, if what happens, as we know will happen, is that the pipelines are going to burst eventually. They're going to leak. And what sort of long-term devastation does that do environmentally, and also to the peoples who rely on that land for sustenance and spiritually and physically? So, and
I think it shows like the interconnected politics of Line 3 and the Upper Harbor Terminal, that, one of the Polead's biggest financial partners, they're finishing right now a big skyscraper downtown with the Royal Bank of Canada, who is the main financer of Line 3. So these are really two expressions of like the ruling class, the capitalist agenda. And I guess that's like a good thing to say as we like kind of wind down, is my goal in talking about this, and the whole reason I've been paying attention to this for all these years, and the whole reason we were going to those toxic meetings, is because for me, this is capitalism taking place in front of us. This is them seizing the land. This is them seizing our resources and building their future. So it's important for us to contest. So I'm interested in breaking down the capitalist economics and painting a picture for an alternative. How could we do housing differently? How could we do our cultural life differently? Venues and I want beautiful fly things. I want good things for North Minneapolis. So I want to affirm that. And so that's why I'm like getting into these conversations around development. What I also want to name, though, is that I don't want to concede the point that there should even be anything on this riverfront land, that it's even our place to be building on this riverfront land. And while we're critiquing, capitalism's development, we have to get to that chief contradiction that this is the stolen land of the Dakota people. And I don't want to even get into like an industrial mind frame myself, and like I'm really open and sympathetic to like degrowth ideas and the ideas that we should be rewilding, and I think that we could be building the public housing we're talking about elsewhere. So just to name that, like we get into like contesting for what could happen on this site. And I'm also in my heart, though, even troubled by the idea of like those big earth moving machines being on the river, and interested in like what it would look like to like really heal the relationship with the river and the people in a deeper way that doesn't always come to the surface. I haven't really spoke about that as often, but like I think it's important to name that,
Yeah, and to your point, there are multiple entities involved in this project who, as you say, are just really highlighting the contradictions of this type of work. You talk about the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board, who are handling the park on this site. They have a deep history of understanding the relationship between building wealth and green spaces at the expense of like genocide and violent removal of indigenous peoples.
Absolutely.
They look at the history of the city, a city that willingly allowed for the destruction of one of the most sacred sites for Dakota peoples to make a concrete underlayment for the St. Anthony Falls. They ripped out Spirit Island, knowing exactly what that meant to the people here, to build a hydroelectric plant that then and a lock and dam that then becomes the sort of industrial basis for the growth of Minneapolis. That relationship has never been healed or addressed by the city. You go further upstream, you know, you think about the relationship between the removal of indigenous peoples from the land, but then also the establishment of an industrial area of North Minneapolis on the river that then was Black people are forcefully put in proximity to, because their lives are valued less, and the land that they live on, according to the city, should also be valued less. So 100 years down the line, we're talking about a community that is struggling with like extreme health repercussions for living in this massive industrial center. We're talking about a community that's being constantly polluted by one of the only urban incinerators in the entirety of the country. Yeah. Because apparently everywhere else they realize that putting an incinerator in the middle of a public area, like into a densely populated area, is probably not smart. But instead that whole cloud just gets to drift over North Minneapolis and poison them.
Next to an asphalt shingles factory that doesn't have to meet the Clean Air Act, that's still going by standards from like the 1930s and shit.
Right. Well, and let's speak on that, because that same shingles factory is right next to the Upper Harbor Terminal site. There's an understanding that the shingles factory is going to be dropping toxicity onto this site. And if you understand the big players in the history of Upper Harbor Terminal, as I know that you do, Jake, you understand that this stuff is a lot messier and fuckier than what they even want you to think. The original council member, Barb Johnson, who pushed this project and wanted this project to go through, really greenlit this project on the back end before proposals were even submitted for this project, is now the head lobbyist for that same shingles company. Right. So like they're playing a long-term game here. This is not just a once in a decade development because of the wealth building opportunities just on this site. It's also with the understanding and the context that this industrial area around this site is also going to be redeveloped into something else, and that is also a massive wealth building opportunity, which is why the parks are already doing like the River First initiative, where they're trying to improve the green spaces along the north side of the river to complete, again, these racist ass founders of the city's visions for how to create a connected city. Like, look into the history of Grand Rounds, look into the history of River First, look into the history of the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board, and who those parks commissioners were, who again were donating land as parks to the city of Minneapolis with the knowledge that the property around that land was going to increase in value. And that was a wealth building opportunity for them.
Absolutely. 100%. Did you see the new battle the park board got in with some Black developers over north on the riverfront?
I did not know.
We'll do a show on it. I'll just do a little teaser right now. But there was a group of Black developers who had actually a parcel owned by Northern Metals. One of their parcels came up for sale. And some Black developers went to the park board and proposed a partnership with the park board to redevelop this land. And the park board sat with them and talked with them, did some negotiations. And then at the end said, nah, we're not interested. And then went behind their back and upbidded them and tried to buy it out from underneath them from Northern Metals. So just completely. And so it's a public battle happening right now between this group of Black developers and the park board, which is, again, we should be critical about Black capitalism. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not necessarily in support of those developers, but it is, again, just another prime example of white supremacy and the white ruling class really having a long-term vision for the city and just bulldozing. I mean, we've never talked about it in detail here, but even on this Upper Harbor Terminal site, there's a Black developer in town named Tim Baylor. He proposed building a music venue with the park board on the Upper Harbor Terminal site like 10 years ago. And they told him, nah, that will never happen. And then they rolled out this plan with First Avenue, only a few years later. So evidence of what you're saying. Honestly,
absolutely.
I feel like we did a pretty good job getting people back into this topic. Is there anything else that's itching you or you want to point people to before we sign off?
Not really. I mean, I would just say, again, like, we had to really work through some trauma to be able to talk about this process again. And I just want to reaffirm to anybody out there, whether you're dealing with the Upper Harbor terminals of your community or the aftermath of the trauma of the summer of 2020, like that makes this work really difficult and it's not fun. And even after all of this, this project is still going to get pushed through. You know what I mean? But I think it's up to us to be thinking about what are alternative political alignments and organizations that we can be building out to oppose this stuff more vigorously, because this is not the only project that's going to come up in our lifetime. And capitalism will continue to kill us if we don't start militantly opposing it, and in all of its facets, whether it be development, whether it be the environmental health of your community, whether it be policing, whether it be wars taking place on the other side of the planet that our politicians are responsible for. So
facts, really well said. And like, I really appreciate you being willing to come down and do these reflections with us. You put in a lot of work to come to these meetings. I'm glad that our camaraderie was sparked by both being interested in this project. And as much as, it feels like we failed in a sense because it's their vision is being pushed through, I really feel like I gained a lot of skills. I gained a lot of relationships through this process. I'm definitely a lot more informed than I was, and again, the mission is not to reform these little itty bitty projects. It's to build a socialist movement that has like a coherent political strategy and that can win the class war, that can box out these big developers, and I think that this struggle has moved us closer in that direction, So listeners, we barely scratched the surface of the Upper Harbor. I really encourage folks who are intrigued by these questions to read the plan. There's pieces of the development that we weren't able to get to. I'm sure we'll circle back to this project. But we thought this was going to be the 100th episode. If I'm guessing right, this is probably the 101st episode. So I want to take the time to say thank you to Kaylee, who's been one of our biggest supporters. Thank you so much, listeners. It was really our anger at this Upper Harbor terminal that brought Isaac and Deanna and I together and got us to make this podcast, and it's been an incredible journey. I didn't think we'd make it 100 episodes, and here we are, still in the trenches of the struggle, and very thankful to be. Thanks again to Kswiftly for joining us. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running